name is Kieran Brooks, radio tower technician from Montana. 30 days ago, I was 300 feet up when the temperature plummeted and civilization collapsed beneath me. I watched cities go dark through my equipment while strange signals warned me what was coming. Now I'm fighting to keep a network of survivors connected as temperatures drop to lethal levels and desperate groups hunt for our communication resources. This is how I survived the first month of the Ice Age apocalypse. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. I never planned on becoming a survivor. Nobody does, I guess, but when you spend most of your life on radio towers in the middle of nowhere, you develop skills that other people just don't have. My name is Kieran Brooks. Before all this, I was a radio tower technician working for Northwest Communications. I maintained remote transmission sites across Montana, Idaho, and parts of Washington state. Most people don't think about the towers that make their phones work or broadcast their favorite radio stations. They're just part of the landscape, invisible infrastructure. But for me, they were home. I lived a solitary life even before the world froze over. I'd spend weeks at isolated outposts, climbing 300-foot structures to repair equipment in blizzards, thunderstorms, whatever nature threw at me. My colleagues thought I was strange for preferring the remote assignments, but I liked the quiet. Liked being able to see for miles from up there. Liked how the world made sense when you looked at it through radio frequencies. Growing up in Montana, I was already used to extreme weather. Winters where temperatures dropped well below zero, summer storms that could tear roofs off barns. My father taught me to respect the weather, not fear it. Weather isn't good or bad. He'd say it just is. Your preparation is what matters. I never imagined how important those words would become. The job taught me other skills too. How to ration supplies when snowstorms cut off access roads. How to insulate against killing cold when power failed. How to listen to the atmosphere through radio static. That last one saved my life, and maybe others too if anyone's still watching this broadcast. 3 days before the world froze, I heard something on the frequencies that nobody believed. I was at the Blacktail Mountain Relay Station, one of our highest elevation sites at nearly 7,000 feet. It was early December, cold but normal for that time of year. I was doing standard maintenance, checking signal strength, replacing worn cables, the usual routine. That's when I noticed it, a strange interference pattern across multiple frequencies. At first, I thought it was equipment malfunction or maybe solar flare activity, but it was too consistent, too patterned. I called it in to my supervisor, Mike. Probably just some military exercise scrambling signals, he said. Document it and we'll send someone to check it out next week. But it wasn't like any interference I'd seen in 12 years of working towers. There was almost a rhythm to it, like a heartbeat growing slower, and it was happening across too many bands simultaneously. Something in the atmosphere was changing. I called again the next day when the pattern intensified. This time I spoke with regional operations. Brooks, we've got actual emergencies to deal with. The Aberdeen Junction is completely down and there's weird weather patterns messing with signals everywhere. Your mountain can wait. They weren't connecting the dots. The interference wasn't just at my location. It was everywhere, growing stronger by the hour. I started recording everything, taking notes, checking weather data. The barometric pressure was dropping faster than I'd ever seen, but the sky looked completely normal. Clear blue, a few high clouds, nothing that signaled what was coming. That night I picked up chatter on emergency frequencies, government agencies, military. Their communications were guarded, coded, but something big was happening. I heard phrases like atmospheric anomaly and prepare for sustained temperature event. One transmission mentioned polar vortex collapse before switching to an encrypted channel. By morning, official channels were reporting unusual cooling patterns across the northern hemisphere, but they were downplaying it. Temporary weather, phenomenon, no cause for public concern. But the radio never lies. Emergency services were mobilizing everywhere. I could hear it in the background of their transmissions, the tension in their voices. I called Mike one last time. Something's coming, something big. The patterns aren't random. The atmosphere is changing fundamentally. Brooks, I've got 6 stations down and corporate breathing down my neck about service interruptions. Just do your job and stop with the doomsday predictions. That was the last normal conversation I had. I was on the tower when it happened, 300 feet up, replacing a damaged antenna. The temperature had been dropping steadily all morning, but nothing dramatic. Then suddenly I felt it. A wind like nothing I'd ever experienced. Not just cold, but wrong somehow. The air itself felt different against my skin. I looked north and saw it coming. A wall of cloudy air, moving fast. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in minutes. My equipment started giving readings that made no sense. Thermometers plunging so fast the digital displays couldn't keep up. Wind speed indicators maxing out. From that height I could see the effect rippling across the landscape below. Trees bending all in the same direction as the front moved through. Then the power started going out. Not all at once, but in sections, like watching a blackout spread, in real time. First the nearest town, then the highway lights, then the more distant communities, one by one going dark as the cold front passed over them. I made it back to the equipment shelter just as the full force hit. The building shuddered. Metal contracted so fast I could hear it groaning. The backup generators kicked in automatically when the main power failed, but I knew they wouldn't last long in these conditions. Emergency broadcasts started flooding every frequency. Power failures across the region. Vehicles stranded on highways. Pipes bursting in homes and businesses. And the temperature kept dropping. Within hours, it was 40 below zero. Then 50. Equipment designed for Montana winters was failing under the extreme cold. I watched through the security cameras as wildlife fled past the station. First deer and elk moving in herds I'd never seen so large. Then predators, wolves, mountain lions, all moving south, all ignoring each other in their panic to escape whatever they sensed was coming. By nightfall, most official broadcasts had gone silent. The ones that remained were increasingly desperate. Evacuation orders, shelter locations, pleas for people to stay in their homes and conserve heat. But underneath it all was the growing realization that this wasn't a normal weather event. This was something unprecedented. I spent that first night monitoring what was left of the emergency channels and preparing the equipment shelter for survival. The building wasn't designed for habitation, but it was solid. Concrete walls, metal roof, decent insulation to protect the sensitive equipment inside. The main room housed servers, transmission equipment, and climate control systems. A small side room contained maintenance supplies, a desk, bathroom facilities, and a cot for technicians working overnight shifts. I took inventory of my supplies. 2 weeks of emergency rations, 20 gallons of drinking water, first aid kit, basic tools. The diesel generator had about 10 days of fuel at normal consumption. I could stretch it by running it intermittently, just enough to prevent equipment and pipes from freezing. That first night was the longest of my life. The wind howled around the building like something alive and angry. The temperature outside dropped to 60 below. I kept expecting the cold to level off, but it just kept getting worse. Even inside, with the heating system working overtime, my breath fogged in front of my face. I didn't sleep. Instead, I modified the equipment room, sealing off unnecessary areas to create a smaller, more insulated space. I moved the cot next to the server racks, which generated enough heat to make a difference. I melted snow for additional water, knowing the plumbing would freeze soon no matter what I did. By morning, the outside world was transformed. Everything covered in frost so thick it looked like snow, but wasn't. This was flash freezing. The trees had split open from the rapid temperature change, cracking like gunshots through the night. The security cameras showed a world drained of color. White, gray, the dull blue of deep ice. I kept the radio equipment running, scanning all frequencies for information. Most were silent now, but occasionally I'd catch fragments. A Canadian military frequency reporting complete infrastructure failure in major cities. A weather station broadcasting automated data showing temperatures still falling. A weak transmission from what sounded like a police officer barricaded in a rural station reporting mass casualties on highways. One by one, the signals died. Equipment failure, power loss, or maybe the people operating them were just gone. But there were other frequencies that remained active. Government channels. Military bands. They weren't broadcasting openly, but I could detect the encrypted transmissions. Someone was still communicating. Someone with power, resources, preparation. By the third day, I spotted the first survivors. The security camera caught them struggling up the access road. 3 figures bundled against the cold, moving slowly through the deep frost. I watched them for an hour, debating whether to help. In the world before, I wouldn't have hesitated, but now resources meant life. Every calorie shared was one less for me. They finally reached the perimeter fence. 2 men and a woman, their faces red and cracked from exposure. Through the intercom, they begged for shelter, said they'd been driving south when their car ran out of gas. Saw the tower on the hill and thought it might have power. I let them in. Maybe it was stupid, but I couldn't watch them freeze to death. They were ordinary people. Peter was an accountant from Spokane. Maria was a nurse who had been working night shift when the temperature dropped. Samuel was a college student who got separated from his family during an evacuation attempt. They brought no food, no useful supplies, just desperation and stories of what was happening below. Cities without power or heat, people freezing in their homes, violence erupting over resources, rumors of government safe zones that no one could find, military blockades on major highways. I shared what food I had, showed them how to arrange sleeping areas near heat sources, and established rules. We would conserve resources, maintain the equipment, monitor communications, and most importantly, we would not allow anyone else inside unless they brought something essential for our survival. It was Maria who first noticed the pattern in the remaining radio transmissions. "They're coordinated," she said on the 4th night. "The broadcast about emergency shelters and evacuation routes, they never overlap. It's like they're taking turns using the same script." She was right. The remaining official broadcasts weren't independent emergency services responding to a crisis. They were following a predetermined protocol, which meant someone had anticipated this. Someone had a plan that didn't include saving everyone. On the 5th day, the generator ran out of fuel. We switched to minimal power from the emergency batteries, enough to keep critical communications equipment running but nothing else. The temperature inside the shelter dropped below freezing. We wore every layer of clothing we had, huddled together at night for warmth, and watched our breath crystallize in the beam of our flashlights. Peter wanted to leave, try to reach one of the emergency shelters being broadcast. "We'll die here," he argued. "At least down there we have a chance." But Maria and I weren't convinced. "Those broadcasts are too perfect," she said. "No mentions of overcrowding or supply shortages, no updates on how many people they've taken in. It feels wrong." Samuel didn't offer an opinion. The cold was affecting him worse than the rest of us. His extremities were showing signs of frostbite despite never going outside. His body, thin from college life, had no reserves to fight the cold. On the 6th day, I picked up a new signal. Faint, irregular, but definitely not automated or official. Someone was broadcasting from another location, trying to reach other survivors. I adjusted the equipment, boosting the reception, and finally made out words. "We'd survivors at Clearwater Junction. 10 people. Running low on medication. Temperature 70 below. If anyone hears this." I responded immediately, giving our location and situation. For hours, we exchanged information with the Clearwater group. They had more people but a less secure location. They'd taken shelter in a rural fire station with better supplies but worse insulation. They too had noticed the coordinated official broadcasts and distrusted them. Through that day, we detected more independent transmissions. Small groups of survivors, mostly in elevated locations where radio equipment still functioned. A forest, service fire lookout with 2 rangers. A weather station with a technician and his family. A mountain resort where staff and a few guests had barricaded themselves in the main lodge. We began coordinating, sharing information about conditions, resources, what worked and what didn't in the extreme cold. A network of survivors, isolated but connected through the technology that had been my life's work. Each day brought new challenges. The cold found new ways into our shelter. Equipment failed. The solar panels that supplemented our power were covered in ice that wouldn't melt. Samuel's condition worsened despite Maria's medical training. Food dwindled faster than I'd calculated. But the radio network grew. 20 distinct survivor groups within broadcast range, each with their own stories, their own resources, their own information. Together, we began mapping the new world. Areas where the cold was most extreme, places where violence had erupted, potential resource caches. And then, on the 7th day, everything changed again. I was up on the tower at dawn, chipping ice from the satellite receiver dish. Even with the extreme cold, maintenance was essential to keep our communications working. From that height, I had a clear view of the valleys below, all the way to what had been the town of Whitefish. The world below looked like an alien planet. White, still, dead. No movement on the roads, no smoke from chimneys. The frozen lake reflected the pale sun like polished metal. But then I noticed something new. Dark shapes moving across the white landscape, following the main highway from the direction of Kalispell. I used the tower's observation equipment, designed for monitoring distant signal impediments, to get a better look. It was a convoy, military vehicles, big ones, 5 of them, moving slowly but steadily through the frozen terrain. Their course would bring them within a few miles of our tower. I rushed back down to inform the others. Samuel was barely conscious by this point, his breathing shallow, skin gray beneath the frostbite. Maria rarely left his side. Peter had been maintaining our dwindling food supplies with meticulous inventory. "Military means help," Peter said immediately. "We need to signal them." Maria wasn't convinced. "Why now? It's been a week. And why? So few vehicles? If this was a rescue operation, there would be more." I shared her suspicion. "They're not broadcasting on any emergency frequencies. No announcements of their approach. That's not standard procedure for rescue operations." We decided to observe but not initiate contact. I returned to the tower with our best binoculars and the radio scanner. For hours I watched as the convoy made its way along the highway, stopping occasionally to clear ice or check buildings near the road. They were systematic, professional, but they weren't picking up survivors. I saw them pass by a stranded vehicle, with people clearly visible inside, waving desperately. The radio scanner picked up their communications, short coded exchanges that told me little except they were well organized and following specific objectives. Then I heard something that confirmed our worst fears. "Checkpoint Delta secure, no priority assets located. Proceeding to Grid 79er for facility assessment." They weren't here to save people. They were securing locations, infrastructure, resources. This was about preserving capability, not lives. I watched them turn off the main highway toward a location I recognized immediately. The Regional Communications Hub, a much larger facility than our relay station. It housed major telecommunications equipment, server farms, and a significant power generation system. This told me 2 things. First, organized authority still existed somewhere, with enough resources to mount operations in the disaster zone. Second, they were prioritizing communication infrastructure, which meant our tower might eventually draw their attention too. Back in the shelter, we debated our options. Peter wanted to try contacting the convoy and offering our technical skills in exchange for evacuation. Maria refused to leave Samuel, who couldn't be moved in his condition. I was torn. The convoy represented resources, potential safety, but also a system that had clearly written off most survivors. While we argued, Samuel's condition deteriorated rapidly. By nightfall, he was gone. We had no way to bury him in the frozen ground, so we moved his body to an exterior storage shed. Maria wept silently as we covered him with a tarp, another casualty of a world that had stopped making sense. That night, the temperature dropped even further. The equipment shelter wasn't designed for this level of cold. Metal contracted, seams, cracked insulation failed. We huddled in the server room, the only space with enough residual heat to keep us alive. I ran constant calculations in my head about power consumption, battery life, and survival odds. The numbers weren't good. I focused on fortifying our position instead of dwelling on statistics. I used maintenance supplies to seal cracks around doors and windows. I repurposed server equipment covers as additional insulation layers. I modified the ventilation system to recirculate warm air from the functioning equipment. Our survival depended on keeping that equipment running, which meant protecting it from the cold at all costs. I constructed a smaller room within the main space, using equipment racks and insulation panels to create a shelter around our most critical systems. We moved our sleeping area inside this improvised fortress, surviving on the heat generated by the machines. By the 10th day, we had established regular communication schedules with 15 survivor groups. Each broadcast was kept brief to conserve power. We shared critical information, temperature readings, resource locations, movements of any organized groups like the military convoy. Together we were creating a map of the new world, identifying patterns that might help us survive. One of those patterns was particularly disturbing. The cold wasn't uniform. Some areas were experiencing even more extreme temperatures than others, creating what one survivor called death zones where nothing could survive. These zones seemed to be expanding and contracting in patterns that didn't match natural weather behavior. Maria, with her medical background, was the first to recognize the implications. "These aren't random fluctuations," she said, pointing to our crude map with temperature readings. "There's a wave pattern. The extreme cold zones are moving like ripples from multiple epicenters." She was right. When we plotted temperature data from all our contacts, clear patterns emerged. The coldest areas were radiating outward from specific locations. I cross-referenced these epicenters with information about known facilities in the region: nuclear plants, military bases, research stations. There were correlations, but also anomalies that didn't match any installation I knew about. On day 12, we lost contact with 3 of our survivor groups simultaneously. All were located in an area that had been experiencing progressively lower temperatures. Their final transmissions reported readings of nearly 100 below zero, temperatures that shouldn't be possible in this region under any natural circumstances. The information void was disturbing enough, but what followed was worse. The next day, the official broadcasts changed their tone. For the first time, they acknowledged the unprecedented nature of the disaster. A repeating emergency message began cycling through all major frequencies. "This is an emergency alert system notification. The United States is experiencing a severe weather catastrophe of unknown duration. All citizens are instructed to shelter in place and minimize all unnecessary energy consumption. Military and FEMA personnel are establishing secure zones in designated areas. Unauthorized travel is prohibited. Interfering with official recovery operations is punishable under emergency powers protocols." The message continued with coordinates for designated secure zones, none of which matched locations where our survivor network had detected actual help or resources. The secure zones were all at major infrastructure sites or government facilities. Peter became increasingly agitated as we monitored these broadcasts. "They're establishing control, not saving people," he said. "We need to go to one of these secure zones before they stop taking people altogether." Maria and I weren't convinced. The official broadcasts hadn't mentioned capacity limits or registration procedures. They provided no information about what survivors would find at these secure zones or how long they would be operational. It felt like a trap, or at least a half-truth. Our debate became moot on day 14 when we spotted another convoy approaching, this one heading directly for our tower facility. 3 vehicles, smaller than the previous group but moving with purpose. Through the binoculars, I could see they were a mix of military and what looked like specialized technical personnel. We had maybe an hour before they reached us. We quickly concealed evidence of our survival network, hiding logs and equipment modifications. Peter wanted to greet them openly as grateful survivors. Maria suggested we hide and observe first. I sided with Maria. Something about their direct approach to our specific location felt targeted. We concealed ourselves in a maintenance crawl space. while still being able to monitor both our equipment and the security cameras. The convoy arrived with practiced efficiency. 2 armed soldiers secured the perimeter, while 3 technicians entered the main building. They weren't searching for survivors. They moved directly to the communication equipment, examining it with professional interest. Primary relay intact, one said into a radio. Signal capacity at approximately 60%. Modulation systems, functional. This location is viable for network integration. They proceeded to connect devices to our communication equipment, uploading something to the systems. They didn't search the residential areas or check for survivors. They were treating the facility as abandoned infrastructure to be repurposed. After they left, we examined what they'd done. They had installed remote access modules and monitoring equipment on our systems. Our communication tower was being integrated into some larger network under their control. Most disturbing, they'd left automated equipment running on emergency power, broadcasting the same official messages we'd been hearing. Our tower was now part of their system, which meant they could detect any transmissions we made, trace any communications with our survivor network. We were compromised. That night, we made the difficult decision to sabotage our own equipment. I disabled the monitoring systems they'd installed while maintaining our ability to receive transmissions. It was delicate work, requiring intimate knowledge of the tower's systems. Fortunately, that was exactly what I had. We could still listen, but we couldn't risk broadcasting without giving away our presence. Our survivor network was effectively silenced unless we could find an alternative communication method. The solution came from Maria's experience with hospital equipment. "What about ultrasonic transmission?" she suggested. "Modified sound waves carrying data. Short range, but if we boost the signal enough." It was possible. I had the technical knowledge, and the equipment shelter contained components that could be repurposed. For 2 days, we worked on creating an alternative communication system, one that wouldn't be detected by conventional monitoring. Meanwhile, Peter grew increasingly paranoid. He was convinced the military would return, that they were tracking all survivors, that the secure zones were processing facilities rather than shelters. His mental state deteriorated along with the temperatures, which continued to drop despite already being far beyond historical records. On the 17th day, we completed our ultrasonic communication system. The range was limited to about 30 miles, but it would allow us to contact the closest survivor groups without detection. We sent out our first transmission, a simple coded message asking for acknowledgement. The response was immediate and unexpected. Not just from the 2 survivor groups within range, but from a dozen different locations. Someone else was already using this method of communication, a parallel network we hadn't detected. "We've been tracking your group," came the first clear message. "Tower technician, nurse, and civilian, we've been waiting for you to go silent on conventional bands." The message continued with instructions for more secure communication, technical specifications that only someone with advanced knowledge would understand. This wasn't a random survivor group. This was organized, sophisticated. I followed their instructions, modifying our equipment according to their specifications. Within hours, we were connected to a network far more extensive than anything we'd built. Dozens of locations across the region, all communicating below the detection threshold of conventional monitoring. The information flowing through this network was startling. Temperature mapping far more detailed than our crude efforts. Movement tracking of all military and government activities. Resource caches marked with capacity and content. And most, surprisingly, plans, evacuation routes, meeting points, safe zones that didn't match the officially broadcast locations. This network had been preparing for something like this disaster. They had infrastructure, supplies, and information we couldn't have gathered on our own. They called themselves the Circuit, and claimed to be composed of people who had recognized the warning signs and prepared accordingly. Their first direct question was about my technical capabilities. When I described my background and experience, with communication systems, there was palpable interest from their side. "We need people with your skills," the response came. "The infrastructure is there, but we're short on qualified technicians." Maria was immediately suspicious. "This is too convenient," she whispered. "An organized group with resources just waiting to recruit people with specific skills? How did they know about this disaster in advance? I shared her concerns, but we were running out of options. Our supplies were critically low. The temperature inside the shelter had dropped to the point where equipment was failing despite our best efforts at insulation. Peter had begun to show signs of frostbite and possibly early hypothermia. I questioned the circuit directly about their foreknowledge. Their response was candid in a way the official broadcasts never were. We monitored the same atmospheric anomalies you did, tower technician. The difference is we believed what the data was telling us. This isn't a natural disaster. The patterns are too regular. The temperature gradients too precise. Someone or something caused this. We've been tracking the epicenter since day one. They sent us data supporting their claims, temperature maps showing the ripple effect Maria had identified, but with far more detail. The coldest areas were, indeed, radiating from specific points, and those points corresponded to facilities that didn't appear on any public maps. We need your help, they continued. Your tower location is strategic. It can connect sections of our network that have been isolated. We can extract your group, but we need you to complete specific modifications to your equipment first. They provided detailed instructions for changes to the tower systems, modifications that would turn our location into an automated relay for their ultrasonic network. The technical requirements were complex but achievable with the components available. Peter was against it. It's another trap, he insisted. First, the government broadcasts, now these mystery preppers. Everyone wants our tower, not us. Maria was more pragmatic. We're going to die here if we do nothing. The supplies are almost gone. The temperature keeps dropping. At least these people are offering extraction instead of just equipment access. I spent that night analyzing their technical instructions, looking for hidden purposes or security risks. The modifications were sophisticated but straightforward. They would indeed create an automated relay station that could function without human presence. There were no obvious traps or monitoring capabilities beyond what was needed for the relay function. By morning, I had made my decision. I would implement their modifications, but with my own safeguards added. Hidden kill switches and monitoring, systems that would alert us to any misuse. It was a compromise between trust and caution. I spent the 20th day making the required changes, working through frozen fingers and equipment that cracked in the cold. Peter watched me with suspicious eyes while Maria tended to his worsening frostbite. The temperature outside had stabilized, around 90 below zero, a level so extreme it seemed to have reached some terrible equilibrium. As I completed the final connections, our ultrasonic receiver picked up new transmissions. Movement reports from circuit outposts describing another military convoy, larger than the previous ones, moving toward our general area. Their estimated arrival time at our location was less than 12 hours. We're moving up extraction, came the urgent message from our circuit contact. Be ready at the North Service Road in 3 hours. Bring only essential personal items and your technical documentation. We'll handle the rest. We had to decide immediately. Stay in our failing shelter and face the approaching military force, or trust strangers who somehow knew too much about the disaster. Maria voted to go, her medical assessment of our physical condition leaving little room for debate. We couldn't survive much longer in these conditions. Peter, despite his suspicions, was too weak from cold and hunger to argue effectively. I made one final adjustment to the tower equipment, a remote monitoring system, accessible through a frequency only, I knew about. If the circuit misused our tower, I would know. It was the best insurance policy I could create under the circumstances. We gathered what little remained of our supplies and the technical documents I'd maintained throughout the disaster. 20 days after the world froze, we prepared to leave the shelter that had kept us alive against impossible odds. Whether we were heading toward salvation or another kind of danger, at least we were making the choice while we still could. As we stepped outside into the killing cold, I looked up at the tower one last time. 300 feet of metal reaching into a sky so cold it seemed brittle. The technological arteries of a civilization that might already be dead. I had no idea if I would ever see it again, or if anyone would be left to use the communications infrastructure that had been my life's work. The circuit's extraction vehicle appeared exactly when promised, a modified all-terrain transport with cold weather capabilities far beyond standard military equipment. As we approached, I noticed details that raised both hope and concern. The vehicle was sophisticated but unmarked. The crew wore no insignia but operated with military precision. They helped us aboard efficiently, medical personnel immediately, attending to Peter's frostbite and our general condition. Inside the transport was the first real warmth we'd felt in 20 days. The contrast was almost painful. As we pulled away from the tower facility, I looked back through the viewport. My tower stood solitary against the white landscape, still functioning, still connecting what remained of humanity in this frozen world. I had no way of knowing then how important that connection would become in the days ahead, or how the knowledge I carried would make me both valuable and vulnerable to forces I didn't yet understand. The circuit's transport moved with surprising speed across terrain that should have been impassable. Its oversized tires had some kind of heating element that prevented ice buildup, and the engine ran quieter than any military vehicle I'd ever encountered. Inside, 3 crew members wore matching insulated gear without insignia or identifying marks. They spoke little but worked with practiced efficiency, checking our vital signs and administering what the medic called thermal stabilization treatment. Whatever was in the injections, it worked. The bone-deep cold that had settled into my body during 20 days in the failing shelter began to recede. Peter's condition improved visibly, the gray pallor of his skin warming. Maria watched everything with clinical interest, asking specific questions about the medications that the medic answered with professional courtesy, but minimal detail. "You're the tower technician," said the driver, the first direct acknowledgement of our identities. "Communications specialist, right?" I nodded, still wary despite their help. "Where are we going?" "Outpost 7, about 60 miles southeast of your position. It's one of our more established locations." The transport had no windows except the small viewport I'd used to watch my tower disappear behind us. The interior lighting was dim, reddish, preserving night vision. The only illumination came from equipment displays showing topographical maps and what looked like thermal imaging of the surrounding terrain. "Who exactly is the circuit?" Maria asked directly. "How did you know about this disaster in advance?" The medic and driver exchanged glances. "We didn't know exactly what would happen," the medic said carefully, "but some of us were monitoring the same atmospheric anomalies your technician noticed. The difference is, we connected them to other data points. Research facilities going dark, certain government personnel relocating, supply chain disruptions that didn't make sense, patterns that suggested preparation for something big." "So your government?" Peter asked, his voice stronger now that warmth had returned to his body. A short laugh from the driver. "No, more like the opposite. Former military, scientists, infrastructure specialists who recognized what was happening and chose to organize outside official channels. When those in power prepare to survive a disaster without warning the public, someone needs to balance the scales." The explanation was plausible, but raised more questions. How had they acquired such sophisticated equipment? How many were they? And most importantly, how had they established such an extensive communication network in just 20 days? I decided to probe their technical knowledge. "The modifications you had me make to the tower, that was for frequency modulation on ultrasonic bands, but with specific harmonic patterns I've never seen before. Military application?" The third crew member, who had been silent until now, answered. "Experimental originally, developed for communication in environments where conventional radio would be detected or disrupted. We've adapted it for our current circumstances." Their knowledge was legitimate. The technical terminology was correct, the applications logical. Either they were exactly who they claimed to be, or they were an extremely sophisticated operation with access to classified communications technology. The journey took approximately 3 hours. Without windows, we had no visual reference for our location, only the occasional sensation of the vehicle navigating difficult terrain. When we finally stopped, the driver announced, "Outpost 7, perimeter. Prepare for entry protocols." There was a series of mechanical sounds, pressurization changes, and then the rear door opened to reveal Not the frozen world outside, but an airlock of some kind. We were guided through this space, then through another sealed door, and suddenly we were inside a facility that defied all expectations. Outpost 7 was built inside what appeared to be an abandoned mining operation. The entrance had been disguised as a collapsed shaft, but inside was a fully functional base extending deep into the mountainside. The temperature was comfortably warm, the air quality good. Lighting came from a combination of electrical fixtures and what looked like bioluminescent panels. About 30 people moved purposefully through the main chamber, working at equipment, stations, organizing supplies, or conferring in small groups. "Welcome to the circuit," said a woman approaching us, tall, with short gray hair, and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. "I'm Dr. Eliza Reeves. I oversee this outpost. You must be the tower team." We introduced ourselves. Reeves led us to what she called orientation, a process that included medical examination, decontamination, and detailed debriefing about our experiences since the disaster began. They were particularly interested in my observations of the military convoys and the modifications made to the tower. "Your technical skills are exactly what we need," Reeves told me after the debriefing. "Our communications network is functional but limited. With your knowledge of the regional tower infrastructure, we could expand our range significantly." Maria was offered a position with their medical team, who were researching cold weather injuries and testing treatments for the extreme conditions outside. Peter, still recovering from exposure, was given less critical responsibilities, helping with inventory and resource management. Over the next few days, I was integrated into their communications division. Their setup was impressive, a combination of conventional equipment modified for extreme conditions, experimental systems I'd never seen before, and improvised solutions that showed considerable ingenuity. They had established connections with 12 similar outposts across the region, all communicating via the ultrasonic network I had helped expand through my tower. The information flowing through this network revealed the true scope of the disaster. The extreme cold had engulfed most of the northern hemisphere. Major cities were essentially dead zones, with infrastructure collapsed and mass casualties. Governments had fractured, with military and emergency services focusing on preserving critical installations rather than civilian rescue. The official broadcasts we'd intercepted were coming from these preserved enclaves, which housed primarily government officials, selected military personnel, and specialists deemed essential. "They knew," explained Teller, the communications lead who had become my primary contact. Not the exact nature of the event, but that something catastrophic was coming. Instead of warning the general population, they made preparations to preserve power structures and strategic capabilities. Designated survivors, essential personnel, the rest were considered expendable. The circuit had formed in response to early warning signs that something was wrong. People from various backgrounds, military, scientific, infrastructure, who noticed the patterns, recognized the implications, and chose to create an alternative network outside official channels. They had established hidden outposts, stockpiled resources, and prepared communication systems that wouldn't be affected by conventional disruptions. "We're not just about survival," Teller continued. "We're documenting everything, the patterns of the cold zones, the military movements, the locations of official enclaves, and most importantly, the epicenters." The epicenters were what interested me most. The points from which the extreme cold seemed to radiate, the anomalies Maria had first identified using our crude temperature mapping. The circuit had been tracking these locations since day one, and their data showed something disturbing. The epicenters weren't natural formations. They were too regular, too precisely positioned. "We think they're artificial," Reeves told me, during a briefing on the 4th day at the outpost. "The temperature patterns don't match any natural phenomenon. They're too structured, too controlled." "Are you suggesting this is deliberate?" Maria asked. She had joined the briefing after expressing concerns about the treatments being developed in the medical division. "That someone caused this disaster, intentionally?" Reeves hesitated. "We don't have definitive proof, but the data suggests these cold zones are being generated or at least manipulated. The question is, by whom and for what purpose? The theory was outlandish, but the evidence was compelling. The circuit had compiled temperature readings from hundreds of points across the region, creating a map that showed clear patterns in what should have been chaotic weather behavior. The coldest areas formed perfect circles radiating outward from specific locations. These locations corresponded to installations that didn't appear on any public maps. We've identified 7 distinct epicenters in North America, Teller explained, showing me the map. Each one is generating a cold zone that expands and contracts in regular patterns. The military convoys you observed are moving between these locations and the official enclaves, suggesting coordination. If they were right, this wasn't just a natural disaster. It was either a catastrophic experiment gone wrong, or something deliberately implemented. Neither possibility was comforting. My role within the circuit quickly evolved from technical consultant to key strategist. My knowledge of the regional communication infrastructure gave me unique insight into how we could expand our network without detection. I worked with their engineers to develop modifications for existing towers, similar to what I had implemented at my original location. Teams were dispatched to apply these modifications to abandoned communication facilities across the region. Each successful conversion expanded our reach, connecting isolated survivor groups and gathering more data about conditions across the continent. Within a week of my arrival, we had doubled the network's coverage area. This expansion brought new information, but also new risks. As our activities increased, so did attention from the military forces controlling the official enclaves. Our teams reported more frequent patrols, electronic scanning of areas near modified towers, and in one case, a direct confrontation that resulted in casualties on both sides. They know someone is operating out here, Reeves admitted during an emergency meeting after the confrontation. They don't know who or how extensive our network is, but they've detected the activity. The incident created divisions within the circuit leadership. Some argued for reducing operations, becoming more covert. Others pushed for more aggressive expansion, saying, "Our window of opportunity was closing." I found myself in the uncomfortable position of being the technical expert whose opinion could tip the balance. The modifications we're making leave minimal electronic signatures, I explained to the assembled leaders. But they're detectable if someone knows exactly what to look for. The military has communication specialists too. Eventually they'll figure out our methods. So we need to change methods, suggested Teller. Adapt faster than they can track us. I had been considering this problem since joining the circuit. There's another approach. The military is focusing on monitoring active communication bands, looking for unauthorized transmissions. But there's an entire infrastructure they're ignoring because they think it's obsolete. What infrastructure? Reeves asked. Landlines, the old copper telephone network. Most of it is still physically intact, just not actively used. In rural areas especially, those lines connect communities in ways the military wouldn't bother monitoring because they consider it dead technology. This insight led to a new strategy. While continuing our ultrasonic network for mobile communications, we began rehabilitating sections of the old telephone infrastructure for fixed locations. Teams were sent to central switching stations with equipment to restore basic functionality, without generating detectable electronic signatures. The work was challenging but effective. Within days, we had established hardline connections between 5 outposts, creating a backbone for our communications that was virtually undetectable using modern monitoring methods. The military was looking for wireless transmissions, satellite, uplinks, digital signatures. They weren't watching for activity on copper wires that had been obsolete for decades. As our network grew, so did the information we gathered. Survivor reports from across the continent painted a grim picture of the new world. The extreme cold had killed millions in the first days alone. Infrastructure failure had claimed millions more. Now, almost a month into the disaster, the remaining population was divided between those in official enclaves, living under strict military control but with access to resources, and those struggling to survive in the frozen wasteland outside. Most disturbing were the reports about the epicenters. The circuit had managed to send observation teams close enough to 3 of the 7 identified locations to gather limited data. What they found confirmed our worst fears. Each epicenter contained a facility with massive power consumption, unusual security measures, and equipment that matched no known conventional technology. "We need someone to get inside one of these facilities," Reeves announced during a strategy session. "Someone with technical expertise who can identify what they're doing and potentially how to stop it." All eyes turned to me. My experience with communication systems made me the obvious choice for understanding unknown technology. But the proposal was essentially a suicide mission. The facilities were heavily guarded, located in the center of the coldest zones where temperatures approached 100 below zero. "I'll go," I said before I could reconsider. "But I need a team with specific skills, and we need to choose the right facility." The planning took 3 days. We selected the epicenter in northern Idaho as our target, based on intelligence suggesting it had the lightest security presence. My team would consist of 5 people: myself, a former Special Forces operator named Collins, a structural engineer, a physicist, and a medical specialist trained in extreme cold conditions. Our approach was meticulously planned. We would travel using a modified transport similar to the one that had brought me to Outpost 7, but with additional cold weather capabilities. Our cover story, if intercepted, was that we were an authorized technical team sent to perform maintenance. We had forged credentials, communication codes extracted from monitored military transmissions, and equipment that matched what legitimate teams would carry. The night before our departure, Maria found me in the communications center, reviewing the latest data from the Idaho epicenter. "This is a one-way mission," she said without preamble. "You know that, right?" I nodded. The survival calculations were simple. Even with the best equipment, the temperatures near the epicenter were beyond human tolerance for extended periods. Add in the military presence and the unknown technology we might encounter, and our chances were minimal. "Someone has to go," I replied. "If these facilities are causing the cold, finding a way to shut them down might be humanity's only chance." Maria handed me a small case. Medical Division developed these thermal regulators, injections that temporarily modify the body's response to extreme cold. They're experimental, but they might buy you extra time. I accepted the case, recognizing it for what it was, a slim hope against impossible odds. "What about Peter? How's he adjusting?" "He's found his place in resource management. Good with numbers, apparently, but he's still fragile. The cold did something to him, not just physically." We both knew what she meant. The experience had changed all of us, but Peter most visibly. The carefree accountant was gone, replaced by someone who flinched at sudden movements and hoarded food when he thought no one was looking. Trauma manifested differently in each survivor. The morning of our departure, the circuit held a briefing for all outpost personnel. Reeves outlined our mission without sugarcoating the dangers or the slim chance of success, but she also emphasized the potential importance of the information we might obtain. If these facilities are indeed generating or controlling the extreme cold, understanding how they work could be the key to humanity's survival. This team is risking everything to bring back that knowledge. As we prepared to board the transport, I took one last look at the communications center I had helped expand. Screens showed the network spreading across the region, connecting survivors, sharing vital information. Whatever happened at the epicenter, this network would continue, preserving what remained of human cooperation in a world where official authorities had abandoned that principle. The journey to the Idaho epicenter would take approximately 10 hours, traversing terrain made all but impassable by the extreme conditions. As the transport pulled away from Outpost 7, I reviewed the mission parameters one final time. We would approach to observation distance, gather preliminary data, then attempt to access the facility using the forged credentials. If successful, my primary objective was to identify the technology being used and its purpose. Secondary objectives included disabling the system if possible, or at minimum, gathering enough information for the circuit to develop countermeasures. The transport's cabin was silent except for the occasional update from navigation. Each team member was absorbed in their own thoughts or last-minute preparation. Collins checked and rechecked our weapons, though we all knew conventional firearms would be last resort options at best. The physicist, Dr. Chen, reviewed calculations about energy requirements for artificial weather manipulation, trying to anticipate what we might find. The structural engineer, Barrows, studied satellite images of the facility taken before the disaster. The medical specialist, Torres, monitored our biomedical readings, ensuring we were all in optimal condition for the mission. As for me, I kept returning to a single question that had haunted me since joining the circuit. If these facilities were indeed the source of the extreme cold, who had created them, and why? What purpose could possibly justify a disaster that had killed millions and threatened to end civilization as we knew it? The answer might lie at the epicenter, but I wasn't certain I was prepared to face it. The transport's navigation system indicated we were crossing into the outer perimeter of the cold zone, generated by the Idaho epicenter. Even with the vehicle's advanced insulation and heating systems, we could feel the temperature dropping rapidly. Outside, according to the external sensors, it was approaching 120 below zero, temperatures that shouldn't be naturally possible in this region under any circumstances. Through the small viewport, I could see the transformation of the landscape. Not just snow and ice, but a different kind of freezing altogether. The air itself seemed to crystallize, creating optical effects that distorted perspective. Trees had shattered from the inside out as their sap flash froze and expanded. The ground had buckled in places where subterranean water had done the same. This wasn't nature. This was something else entirely. And we were heading directly toward its source, carrying nothing but fragile human bodies and the desperate hope that understanding might lead to salvation. Whether we would find answers or simply add our names to the disaster's casualty count remained to be seen. But as the cold intensified around our transport, I knew we had passed the point where turning back was an option. The only way now was forward, into the heart of an artificial winter that had brought civilization to its knees. As we approached the outer security perimeter of the Idaho epicenter, the instruments inside our transport began to malfunction. Temperature sensors fluctuated wildly before going offline completely. Navigation systems showed impossible readings, our position jumping erratically across the digital map. Even our communications with the circuit became distorted, the ultrasonic frequencies warping in ways that defied technical explanation. Something's interfering with our equipment, I told the team, trying to recalibrate the instruments. Some kind of electromagnetic disruption, but unlike anything I've encountered before. Collins, the former Special Forces operator, checked his weapon again, a nervous habit that had intensified as we got closer to the facility. Could be defensive measures. Military uses similar tech to disrupt guidance systems on incoming threats. This isn't military tech, Dr. Chen said, studying the readings on her tablet. The energy signature is all wrong. It's like the laws of physics are being locally modified. Looking through the viewport, I could see the facility coming into view. The epicenter consisted of a central structure surrounded by smaller buildings, all constructed of materials that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light. No windows were visible from our approach angle. The entire complex radiated a sense of wrongness against the frozen landscape, like an intrusion from a different reality. Most striking was the visible distortion in the air around the facility. Not heat shimmer, the opposite. The air itself seemed to be crystallizing in concentric patterns, forming and dissolving in rhythmic pulses that matched the interference affecting our equipment. "We need to go on foot from here," Collins advised. "The transport systems are too compromised to get closer without risking complete failure." It was a dangerous but necessary decision. The temperature outside was beyond lethal, and even with our specialized gear, we would have limited time before exposure became critical. Torres, our medical specialist, distributed the thermal regulators Maria had provided. "These will temporarily modify your body's response to extreme cold," she explained, echoing Maria's words to me. "Inject directly into the carotid artery for fastest distribution. The effect lasts approximately 4 hours, after which your core temperature will drop rapidly without re-injection." The injection was painful, burning through my veins like liquid fire. But within minutes I could feel my perception of the cold changing. It was still there, an absolute presence against my skin, but the debilitating effect was muted, allowing function despite the impossible temperature. We exited the transport wearing the most advanced cold weather gear the circuit had been able to provide. Multiple layers of experimental insulation, oxygen systems to prevent lung damage from the frozen air, and goggles to protect our eyes from flash freezing. Even with these precautions and the thermal regulators, Torres estimated we had less than 3 hours of safe exposure. The approach to the facility was surreal. Each step felt like moving through invisible resistance, as if the air itself had become partially solid. Sound behaved strangely too, our communications through the headset sometimes arriving before they were spoken, sometimes delayed by several seconds. Reality seemed increasingly fluid the closer we got to the source. A security fence surrounded the complex, but surprisingly, it showed no signs of power. No electrification, no alarm systems, no motion sensors. It was as if they considered the extreme conditions defense enough against intruders, or perhaps other measures were in place that we couldn't detect. Collins cut through the fence with specialized tools, creating an opening just large enough for us to pass through single file. Beyond the fence was a no-man's land of maybe 50 yards, then the nearest outbuilding. No guards were visible, no security cameras that we could identify. The absence of conventional security measures was more unnerving than their presence would have been. We moved quickly across the open ground, staying low despite the apparent lack of surveillance. The main building loomed ahead, a structure of impossible angles that seemed to absorb the faint light rather than reflect it. No entrances were visible from our position. There, Barrows, our structural engineer, pointed to a smaller building, connected to the main structure by what looked like a covered walkway, service access most likely, less secured than the main entrances. We approached the indicated building, moving as silently as possible through the crystallizing air. Up close, the material of the structures was even stranger, not metal or concrete, but something that seemed to shift subtly when viewed directly, as if reluctant to be defined by human perception. The door was standard enough, metal with an electronic access panel. This, at least, was familiar territory. I connected a bypass device I had modified for extreme conditions, running decryption algorithms against the security system. After tense minutes that felt like hours, the panel flashed green and the door mechanism released with a soft click. Inside was warmer, not comfortable but above freezing, enough that our breath no longer crystallized immediately. The interior was utilitarian. Narrow corridors, minimal lighting, no identifying signage. It had the feel of a service area, mechanical spaces designed for maintenance rather than regular human occupation. We moved cautiously through the corridors, following the structural logic toward what should be the central facility. No personnel were encountered, which seemed impossible for an operational installation of this size. Either the staffing was minimal to the point of negligence, or they were concentrated in specific areas we hadn't yet reached. After navigating a maze of identical corridors, we reached a junction with a more substantial door. Unlike the exterior access, this had both electronic and mechanical security, a keypad and a physical lock requiring credentials we didn't possess. "This is taking too long," Collins whispered, checking his watch. "We've been inside for 40 minutes already. The regulators won't last forever." I studied the security system, recognizing components but not the overall design. "This isn't standard government issue. The architecture is all wrong." Chen examined the wall beside the door, running instruments over the surface. "There's massive power flowing through conduits behind this wall. Whatever's on the other side is drawing enormous energy. Our options were limited. A brute force approach would likely trigger security measures we couldn't counter. Bypassing the electronic system might be possible, but the physical lock remained an obstacle. Time was running short. Then Torres noticed something odd about the access panel. The wear pattern on the keypad. Only certain numbers show usage. She was right. 4 of the 10 digits showed signs of repeated contact. Slight discoloration. Minimal residue from human touch despite the overall sterile environment. It narrowed the possible combinations significantly. Using a modified scanner, I was able to detect residual heat signatures from recent access, giving us the likely sequence. The electronic lock disengaged with a soft tone. The physical lock remained, but now Barrows could apply his expertise, using specialized tools to manipulate the mechanism without triggering security protocols. The door opened to reveal a transition space, an airlock or decontamination chamber of some kind. We cycled through it according to the automated instructions, emerging into an environment that defied expectations. The central chamber was vast, at least 10 stories high, with a domed ceiling of the same light-absorbing material as the exterior. The temperature here was normal, comfortable even. Walkways and observation platforms surrounded a central column that pulsed with energy, extending from floor to ceiling. The column contained something that hurt to look at directly, not from brightness but from a quality that seemed to reject visual processing. It was as if that central space contained a hole in reality itself. Around the chamber, workstations were arranged in concentric circles, staffed by personnel in unmarked uniforms. They were focused intently on their tasks, monitoring readings and making adjustments to systems I couldn't identify. None had noticed our entrance through what was clearly a secondary access point. "What is this place?" Barrows whispered, his engineering background providing no context for what we were seeing. Chen's expression was a mixture of scientific fascination and horror. "It's a dimensional inversion generator. Theoretical physics predicted the possibility, but the energy requirements should make it impossible." "Dimensional what?" Collins asked, keeping his weapon ready but concealed. "It's creating a localized point where thermodynamic laws are reversed," Chen explained, her voice trembling slightly. "Heat is being pulled from our environment and channeled elsewhere. That's why it's so cold outside. This facility is literally extracting thermal energy from the surrounding area." The implications were staggering. This wasn't weather control or climate manipulation as we had theorized. It was something far more fundamental, a technology that could selectively violate the basic laws of physics within a defined area. "But why?" I asked. "Why create artificial cold zones across the continent?" Chen shook her head. "I don't know. This technology could have many applications: energy production, weapons development, or something we can't even conceive of yet." We needed to gather more information. Staying in the shadows of the secondary platform, we observed the operation, recording what we could with the equipment we had brought. The personnel followed routines that suggested this was a long-term installation, not a response to the disaster. They had been here before the world froze, prepared for what was coming. After 20 minutes of observation, we had confirmed several key facts. First, this was indeed the source of the cold zone, a machine that extracted thermal energy from the environment and channeled it elsewhere. Second, it was one of several such facilities operating in coordination, based on communications we intercepted between staff members. Third, and most disturbing, the system was being deliberately modulated to expand the affected area according to a predetermined schedule. "They're increasing the range," Chen whispered, as we watched technicians make adjustments to the system. "The cold zone is going to expand again." We needed to act. Our mission parameters included gathering information, but also sabotage if possible. Looking at the facility layout, I identified critical points where disruption would be most effective. "The power regulation systems," I said, pointing to a series of workstations on the lower level. "If we can overload them, it might force an emergency shutdown." Collins nodded. "I can create a diversion on the far side. Give you maybe 2 minutes to access the systems." It was risky, but our window of opportunity was closing. The thermal regulators would begin wearing off soon, and our presence would eventually be detected regardless of our precautions. We split into 2 groups. Collins and Torres would create a diversion, while Chen, Barrows, and I would attempt to access the power regulation systems. The timing had to be perfect with minimal harm to personnel. Our goal was to disable the technology, not cause casualties among people who might simply be following orders without understanding the consequences. Collins moved into position, preparing to trigger emergency systems on the far side of the chamber. I readied the specialized tools I would need to interface with the unknown technology of the power systems. But before we could initiate our plan, something unexpected happened. An alarm sounded, not in response to our presence but apparently from some predetermined alert system. The personnel began emergency procedures, securing workstations and moving with practiced efficiency toward designated positions. On the main display screens, data flowed in patterns that even I couldn't interpret, but the reaction of the staff made the meaning clear. Something had gone wrong with the system itself. "Look at the central column," Chen whispered urgently. "The inversion field is destabilizing." The column of energy was indeed changing, pulsing irregularly, the visual distortion becoming more pronounced. Staff members were working frantically at control stations trying to stabilize whatever process was underway. "Is it shutting down?" Barrows asked hopefully. Chen's expression was grim. "No, it's accelerating. The energy extraction is increasing beyond their controlled parameters." We had a decision to make. Continue with our sabotage plan, potentially making an already dangerous situation worse, or observe and gather intelligence about how the system responded to crisis. Before we could decide, the choice was made for us. The central column flared with impossible energy, releasing a pulse that rippled through the chamber. Equipment sparked and failed across multiple workstations. Personnel were thrown backwards from their positions, some rendered unconscious by the surge. And through it all, the temperature in the chamber began to drop precipitously. "The containment field is failing," Chen said, checking her instruments. "The inversion effect is bleeding into the facility itself." We could feel it already. Despite our protective gear and the thermal regulators, the cold was returning, more intense than before. The staff who remained conscious were abandoning workstations, heading for emergency exits. Automated systems engaged, sealing sections of the facility to contain the breach. "We need to get out," Collins urged, rejoining our group. "This whole place is going critical." But I saw an opportunity in the chaos. Wait, the system's main control node is exposed now. If I can access it directly, I might be able to extract data about the entire network. Locations of other facilities, operational parameters, fail-safes. "There's no time," Torres argued, showing readings from her medical scanner. "The thermal regulators are already being overwhelmed by the temperature drop. We have maybe 20 minutes before exposure becomes fatal." It was a calculated risk. The facility was failing, potentially solving our sabotage problem for us. But without understanding why or how these systems were created, we couldn't prevent it from happening again. The information could be crucial for humanity's survival. "You all head back to the transport," I decided. "Get that data to the circuit. I'll access the control node and follow when I can." They protested, of course. Team cohesion demanded no one be left behind. But the logic was undeniable. One person had a better chance of moving quickly through the failing facility than a group. And if someone had to take that risk, it should be the person with the technical expertise to extract the critical information. After a brief but intense argument, they agreed. Collins gave me his remaining thermal regulator injection, a few more hours of protection against the intensifying cold. Chen quickly briefed me on what to look for in the control systems. Barrows provided a structural layout of the most likely evacuation routes. Torres checked my vital signs one last time, making adjustments to my protective gear to maximize its effectiveness. Then they were gone, moving swiftly back the way we had come, while I descended toward the now abandoned central control station. The temperature continued to drop as the inversion field bled into the facility. Ice was forming on surfaces, spreading in crystalline patterns that matched the distortions we had observed outside. The main control node was a marvel of engineering, unlike any computer system I had ever encountered. The interface was partly physical, partly something else, responsive to gesture and thought in ways that seemed impossible. I connected my data extraction tools, hoping they would be compatible enough to pull information from this alien technology. To my surprise, the system accepted the connection. Data began flowing into my storage devices, vast amounts of it, more than I had anticipated. Schematics, operational parameters, communication protocols between the 7 facilities. And buried within it all, the answer to the question that had driven our mission: why create these cold zones in the first place? The answer was simultaneously simple and incomprehensible. The dimensional inversion wasn't just extracting thermal energy from our environment, it was creating a bridge. The energy wasn't being destroyed, it was being transferred elsewhere. And something was meant to cross back along that thermodynamic gradient. The data included references to preparation phases and arrival protocols. This wasn't a weapon or an energy project. It was a doorway. They were changing the fundamental properties of our reality to make it compatible with something else, something that required extreme cold to exist in our dimension. I was still processing this revelation when the system entered catastrophic failure. The central column's energy pattern collapsed, releasing a final pulse that shattered equipment throughout the chamber. The temperature plummeted instantly, far beyond what even my enhanced protection could handle. My extraction tools were still connected, still pulling data, but I knew I had seconds at most before the cold rendered me incapable of movement. With numb fingers, I disconnected the devices, securing them inside my insulated gear. The extraction was incomplete, but what I had might be enough to understand the full scope of what we were facing. If I could get it back to the circuit, if I could survive the journey through a facility that was rapidly becoming a tomb of ice. The main exits were already sealed by emergency protocols. I would need to find an alternative route, perhaps through maintenance areas or emergency evacuation paths not yet compromised by the spreading cold. Moving was becoming difficult, each step requiring intense concentration as my body fought against the effects of exposure despite the thermal regulator. I had no way of knowing if the others had reached the transport safely, or if they would wait for me given the deteriorating conditions. The communication systems had failed completely when the central column collapsed. I was alone in a dying facility, carrying information that might be crucial for humanity's survival, with no clear path to escape and dwindling physical resources to attempt it. As ice formed on my protective gear and the cold penetrated deeper into my core, I forced myself to continue moving, one step at a time, one corridor at a time, following the emergency lighting that still functioned in sections, looking for any route that might lead outward. The data I carried had to reach the circuit. Without it, humanity would remain blind to the true nature of what we were facing. Not just a climate disaster, but preparation for something coming through the cold. Something that the people who built these facilities were willing to sacrifice millions to welcome. The corridor ahead was blocked by a security door, sealed by the emergency protocols. I diverted to a maintenance shaft, climbing through increasingly confined spaces as the cold made every movement more difficult. My thinking was becoming sluggish, a dangerous sign despite the thermal regulator. Time was running out faster than I had anticipated. I found myself in what appeared to be a service area for exterior maintenance, with an emergency exit designed for evacuating technicians if main routes were compromised. The door was sealed, but not through the central security system. It had a manual override that might still function. With the last of my strength, I activated the override, forcing mechanical systems to engage despite the extreme cold that had made the metal brittle. The door opened with a crack of breaking ice, revealing the frozen wasteland outside, and beyond it, incredibly, the lights of our transport, still waiting despite the deteriorating conditions. The team had remained, risking their own survival for the chance that I would emerge with the critical data. I could see them now, Collins and Torres in protective gear near the perimeter fence, scanning for any sign of my approach. I activated my emergency beacon, a simple signal that required minimal power but might be enough to alert them to my position. They spotted me or the signal, turning immediately in my direction. I began moving toward them, each step an immense effort through the crystallizing air. The distance seemed impossible, maybe 200 yards of exposed terrain and temperatures that could kill within minutes even with protection. I focused on the mission, on the data, on the need to warn humanity about what was really happening. One step after another, the cold penetrating deeper with each passing second. My vision narrowing, darkening at the edges. The lights of the transport seeming to recede rather than grow closer despite my continued movement. Torres reached me first, her medical training immediately evident as she assessed my condition while supporting my weight. Collins took my other side, practically carrying me as we moved toward the transport. I tried to speak to tell them about what I had discovered, but my frozen lips couldn't form the words. "Save it," Torres said, administering something through my protective gear. "Just stay conscious, we'll get you back." The last thing I remembered before losing consciousness was being pulled into the transport. The relative warmth painful against frozen skin, and the secure weight of the data devices still pressed against my chest. Whether the information I had risked everything to obtain would be enough to change humanity's fate remained to be seen. But I had completed the mission. I had found the source of the cold. Now it was up to the circuit to determine what to do with that knowledge. When I regained consciousness, I was in the medical section of Outpost 7, surrounded by monitoring equipment and the concerned faces of my team. Torres was checking readings, making adjustments to treatment protocols. Chen was already working. With the data I had extracted, her expression a mixture of fascination and horror as she began to understand what we were facing. "You made it," Maria said from beside my bed. Though it was close. Another few minutes in that cold and we wouldn't be having this conversation. I tried to sit up, finding my body responding sluggishly. "The data. Did we get enough?" Chen nodded without looking up from her work. "More than enough to understand what they've done, though I almost wish we hadn't. The recovery would take time. My body had been pushed beyond normal human tolerance, saved only by the experimental treatments and prompt medical intervention. But while my physical healing progressed, the true impact of our discovery was just beginning to unfold. The facilities weren't causing the disaster as a side effect of some other purpose. The disaster was the purpose. The cold was preparation. And based on the operational timelines we had extracted, the final phase was approaching more rapidly than anyone could have anticipated. The circuit leadership gathered to assess our findings, faces grim as the full implications became clear. We had discovered the how and why of the disaster. Now we needed to determine if anything could be done to stop what was coming through the cold. My recovery at Outpost 7 took 3 days. 3 days of medical treatments, thermal rebalancing, and endless debriefings as the circuit's leadership tried to make sense of the data I had extracted from the Idaho facility. 3 days where the outside temperature continued to drop, where survivor reports became increasingly desperate, and where the pattern of the cold zones shifted in ways that matched the preparation phase timetables we had discovered. I wasn't the only one recovering. Collins had suffered minor frostbite during the extraction. Chen was experiencing cognitive disruptions from prolonged exposure to the dimensional anomalies at the facility. Torres and Barrows had fared better, physically, but all of us carried the psychological weight of what we had witnessed, what we now understood. Dr. Reeves called a full outpost assembly on the morning of the 4th day. Every member of the circuit stationed at Outpost 7 gathered in the main chamber. Nearly 100 people now, as survivors from smaller outposts had consolidated their operations. The mood was tense, expectant. Rumors had spread about what we had discovered, each version more alarming than the last. "What we're about to share will sound impossible," Reeves began once everyone had assembled. "But the evidence is conclusive. The disaster we've been experiencing is not a natural phenomenon, nor is it an accident. It is a deliberate terraforming of our environment." She nodded to Chen, who activated a holographic display showing the data we had extracted. Complex equations, energy transfer models, and, most disturbing, a countdown sequence that was now visible across multiple systems. The dimensional inversion generators at the 7 epicenters are creating conditions suitable for entities from another reality, Chen explained, her voice clinical despite the extraordinary content. They're systematically altering the fundamental physical properties of our world to make it compatible with these entities. Questions erupted from the assembled personnel. Who built these facilities? Who authorized this? Why would anyone deliberately create conditions that killed millions? Chen raised her hands for silence. Based on the communications logs we extracted, this project has been in development for at least 15 years. It involves elements from multiple governments, private, sector organizations, and scientific institutions. The authorization came from a group identified only as the Vanguard. Their stated objective is, and I quote, transcendence through integration with superior extra-dimensional intelligences. The implications were clear. A cabal of powerful individuals had decided to sacrifice humanity for what they perceived as evolution through contact with entities from beyond our reality, entities that required extreme cold to exist in our dimension. The cold is just the beginning, I added, standing despite Maria's concerned glance. The data shows 3 phases. First, temperature reduction to create suitable conditions. Second, dimensional thinning to allow initial contact. Third, full breach and arrival of what they call the architects. We're nearing the end of phase 1. Reeves took over again, addressing the practical questions. We now understand what's happening. The question is what we can do about it. The facility that Kieran's team investigated experienced a catastrophic failure, likely due to the accelerated timetable the Vanguard implemented. That gives us both hope and cause for concern. Hope, because it proved these systems could fail. Concern because the failure of one facility had been immediately compensated for by the others, which had increased their output to maintain the overall cooling effect. A systematic approach would be needed to disrupt all 7 facilities simultaneously. We don't have the resources for a direct assault on all epicenters, Collins pointed out. Even with every member of the circuit mobilized, we'd be facing heavily defended installations in environment conditions that are nearly unsurvivable. He was right. A frontal approach was impossible. But the data I had extracted suggested another possibility, one that played to our strengths rather than our weaknesses. We don't need to physically attack the facilities, I said, pulling up schematics from the extracted data. The inversion generators are networked. They require constant coordination to maintain dimensional stability across all epicenters. That communication happens through conventional channels that we can access. This was where my expertise as a communications technician became crucial. The Vanguard had built advanced technology to breach dimensions, but they still relied on existing infrastructure to coordinate their operations. Infrastructure that I understood intimately. If we can inject conflicting instructions into their coordination network, we could force the systems to work against each other instead of in harmony, I explained. It wouldn't shut them down directly, but it would create instabilities that might cascade into system failures. It was a sophisticated approach that would require precise execution. We would need to access multiple points in the communications network simultaneously, introducing carefully crafted disruptions that would appear as legitimate instructions to the automated systems. The planning took another full day. We identified key nodes in the communication infrastructure where we could insert our countermeasures: transmission towers, satellite uplinks, fiber optic junctions. Some were in remote areas made inaccessible by the extreme cold. Others were in the secure zones controlled by military forces loyal to the Vanguard. Each would require a specialized team with specific technical skills and equipment. We divided the remaining circuit members into strike teams, each assigned to a critical access point. I would lead the team targeting the primary coordination hub, a satellite uplink facility in what had been Glacier National Park before the disaster. Now it was the center of the coldest zone in the region, with temperatures hovering around 130 below zero. The most dangerous assignment, but also the most crucial. My team would consist of 6 people. Myself, Collins for security, Chen for her understanding of the dimensional technology, Torres for medical support, and 2 communication specialists from the circuit who had the necessary technical background to implement our countermeasures. As we prepared for deployment, Maria approached me in the equipment room. She wouldn't be joining the mission, having been assigned to coordinate the medical response for all teams from Outpost 7. The thermal regulators have been improved, she said, handing me a case containing the injections. Based on data from your previous exposure, they should provide better protection for longer periods. But they're still experimental, and the side effects become more pronounced with repeated use. I nodded, accepting the case. What kind of side effects? Neurological mainly. Disorientation, memory disruption, possibly hallucinations in extreme cases. The body isn't designed to operate in these temperature ranges, even with chemical assistance. It was one more risk in an operation, already filled with them, but compared to what would happen if the Vanguard succeeded in bringing their architects through, it was a risk worth taking. The mission was scheduled to launch 28 days after the disaster began. All teams would move simultaneously, reaching their assigned access points at precisely the same time to implement the countermeasures. Coordination would be maintained through the circuit's ultrasonic network, which operated outside the frequencies monitored by the Vanguard. The Meteor. Night before deployment, I couldn't sleep. I found myself in the communications center, reviewing the countermeasure code one last time, looking for any flaws or weaknesses that might compromise the mission. The code was elegant in its simplicity, a virus designed to make each inversion generator believe the others were operating at different parameters than they actually were. The resulting attempts to compensate would create a feedback loop that should eventually force emergency shutdowns at all facilities. Peter found me there, his recovery from the initial disaster now complete, though he still carried the psychological scars. He had become an integral part of the circuit's operations, his accounting background proving valuable for resource management across the scattered outposts. "Shouldn't you be resting?" he asked, sitting beside me at the workstation. I shook my head. Too much on my mind. "I've been analyzing the resource projections if this mission fails," he said after a moment of silence. "The temperature decline is accelerating. At current rates, the continental landmass will be uninhabitable within another 2 weeks. Even the Vanguard secure zones won't survive what's coming." It was information I already knew, but hearing it stated so directly reinforced the stakes of our mission. This wasn't just about saving the survivors. It was about whether humanity would continue to exist at all. "We'll stop it," I said with more confidence than I felt. "The system has vulnerabilities. We found them." Peter nodded, though his expression remained doubtful. "I should have believed you when you first warned about the atmospheric anomalies back at the tower. Maybe if more people had listened earlier." "It wouldn't have mattered," I replied. The Vanguard was prepared for opposition. They orchestrated the disaster knowing there would be resistance. That's why the military secured communications infrastructure first, to control the flow of information. The conversation drifted into speculation about what would happen if we succeeded. Even if we stopped the dimensional breach, the damage to Earth's climate system was extensive. Recovery would take years, perhaps decades. The world we had known was gone regardless of the outcome. The question was whether we would have a chance to build something new from the ruins, or if our reality would be overwritten entirely by whatever waited on the other side of the breach. Morning came too quickly. Final preparations were made in tense silence. Equipment checked and rechecked. Communication protocols verified. Extraction plans reviewed for each team, though we all knew that for some assignments, extraction might not be possible depending on how the systems reacted to our intervention. Our transport was modified for the extreme conditions we would face at the uplink facility. Additional insulation, redundant heating systems, power supplies designed to function in temperatures that would normally freeze conventional batteries instantly. The technical preparations were thorough, but the human factor remained the greatest vulnerability. No amount of equipment could fully protect against the conditions we would encounter. The journey to the uplink facility was the most challenging I had experienced since the disaster began. The transport struggled against environments it wasn't designed to navigate, even with modifications. Ice formations had created landscapes that defied conventional traversal. Magnetic anomalies from the dimensional thinning disrupted navigation systems, forcing us to rely on visual references that were themselves distorted by the extreme cold. As we approached the outer perimeter of the uplink facility, the effects of the nearby inversion generator became increasingly pronounced. Light behaved strangely, bending around solid objects or splitting into spectral components that shouldn't be possible outside laboratory conditions. Sound propagated inconsistently, sometimes carrying for impossible distances, other times deadened completely just feet from its source. The facility itself was smaller than the epicenter. We had investigated a support installation rather than a primary generator, It consisted of a main building housing the satellite uplink equipment and several outbuildings for power generation and maintenance. Security appeared minimal, a perimeter fence, automated surveillance systems, but no visible human presence. The Vanguard was relying on the environmental conditions as their primary defense, and with good reason. Without our specialized equipment and treatments, approaching the facility would be a death sentence. We established a base camp just beyond detection range, performing final equipment checks before committing to the approach. Torres administered the improved thermal regulators. The injection slightly less painful than the previous version, but still uncomfortable as the compound spread through my system. Remember 4-hour effective duration, she reminded us. After that, degradation accelerates rapidly. We need to be clear of the extreme zone before the time limit. We moved toward the facility and practiced formation, Collins on point watching. For security measures, Chen monitoring dimensional anomalies, the 2 communication specialists flanking me with the equipment we would need to access the uplink systems. Torres remained vigilant about our physical condition, ready to intervene at the first sign of cold-related injuries despite the regulators. The perimeter security was easily overcome. The automated systems were designed to function in normal conditions, not the extreme environment that now existed. Electronics failed in predictable ways when exposed to temperatures far beyond their operational parameters. With minimal effort, we bypassed the outer defenses and approached the main building. Access to the interior was similarly straightforward. The facility had been designed for function rather than security, with standardized entry systems that I had encountered at dozens of similar installations before the disaster. Within minutes, we were inside the uplink control center, surrounded by sophisticated communications equipment that linked the 7 epicenters. System is active but unmanned, one of the communications specialists observed, examining the control interfaces. Fully automated operation with remote monitoring only. This confirmed our initial assessment. The Vanguard couldn't maintain human personnel at these support facilities given the environmental conditions. They were relying on automation and remote oversight, a vulnerability we could exploit. I connected our equipment to the primary control systems, gaining access to the coordination network that synchronized the inversion generators. The architecture was complex but recognizable, built on conventional protocols that had been adapted for their specialized purpose. Chen provided technical guidance based on the data we had extracted from the Idaho facility, helping identify the critical nodes where our countermeasures would be most effective. The dimensional parameters are fluctuating more than anticipated, she noted, studying the real-time data. The system is struggling to maintain stability across all epicenters. That works in our favor. We began uploading our countermeasures, a carefully crafted sequence of instructions designed to create increasing instability in the network. The first stage involved subtle parameter shifts, changes small enough to avoid triggering immediate alerts but significant enough to force compensatory adjustments at each epicenter. These adjustments would cascade, each response triggering further deviations that would gradually amplify throughout the system. Upload at 20%, the communication specialist reported. No detection so far. The system is accepting the modifications as authorized updates. Through our secure channel, we received confirmation that other teams had reached their assigned access points and begun implementing their portions of the countermeasures. The operation was proceeding, according to plan, a coordinated strike against the Vanguard's network that they couldn't possibly respond to in time. Then everything changed. Warning indicators activated across the control interfaces. The system had detected the intrusion, not at our location, but at one of the other access points. Emergency protocols engaged, attempting to isolate compromised segments of the network. They're initiating a security lockdown, I warned the team, fingers flying across the interface. We need to complete the upload before we're cut off. The communications specialists worked frantically to maintain our connection as the system erected barriers around critical functions. I modified our approach on the fly, targeting fewer nodes, with more aggressive disruptions to compensate for the reduced access time. Upload at 60%, came the update. Connection unstable, security countermeasures activating. Through the secure channel, we received fragmented reports from other teams, Some had completed their uploads before detection. Others were facing active resistance, both from automated systems and, in some cases, security personnel who had responded despite the environmental conditions. The coordinated attack was becoming uncoordinated, the elegant plan dissolving into isolated struggles at each access point. "We need to focus on the primary coordination protocols," Chen advised, pointing to specific systems on the interface. "If we can disrupt those, it doesn't matter if we can't complete the full upload. The epicenters won't be able to synchronize." She was right. I redirected our efforts, targeting the core synchronization functions that kept the 7 inversion generators working in harmony. Even as access to peripheral systems was cut off by security protocols, we maintained connection to these essential components. "Upload at 80%, the specialist reported. "System is implementing countermeasures. We're losing access." I had anticipated this possibility. From my kit, I removed a specialized device I had developed specifically for this scenario, a hardware override that would bypass the software security by creating a direct connection to the physical components of the uplink system. "Hold this position," I instructed the team. "I need to access the transmission hardware directly." The uplink's primary components were housed in a separate area of the facility, a climate-controlled space containing the sensitive equipment that maintained connection with the satellite network. I moved quickly through the corridors following schematics memorized during mission preparation. Time was critical now, with security protocols closing off access points throughout the system, and our thermal regulators approaching their effective duration limit. The transmission hardware was exactly as expected, standard configurations that I had worked with countless times in my previous life. I connected my override device directly to the primary signal processors, establishing a connection that bypassed the software security entirely. From this position, I could inject our remaining countermeasures directly into the outgoing data stream. Through my headset, I received updates from the team. Other access points were being locked down one by one. Some teams had completed their objectives. Others had been forced to abort. The coordinated attack had become fragmented. But enough. Disruption had been created to destabilize the network. The question was whether it would be sufficient to force a system-wide failure. I completed the upload from my position, sending the most aggressive countermeasures directly into the coordination network. Immediately, I could see the effects in the system diagnostics. Synchronization errors multiplied across the network. Compensation algorithms activated but were unable to resolve the conflicts created by our manipulated instructions. The epicenters began working against each other rather than in concert. "It's working," Chen confirmed through the headset. "Dimensional stability is degrading across all epicenters. The system can't maintain coherence." But the vanguard wasn't surrendering. Without a fight, emergency protocols I hadn't anticipated began to engage. Isolation procedures designed to allow each epicenter to function independently if the coordination network failed. They had built redundancies I hadn't accounted for, fail-safes that might allow their plan to continue even without perfect synchronization. I had one final option, a more direct approach that carried significant risks. The uplink facility included an emergency termination system, a fail-deadly protocol that would send shutdown commands to all connected systems if the facility itself was critically compromised. It was designed to prevent unauthorized access to the network in worst-case scenarios. Triggering this system would force all epicenters to initiate emergency shutdown procedures simultaneously. It would be more effective than our gradual disruption approach, but it would also alert the vanguard immediately to our presence and intentions, and it would require physically damaging the facility in ways that might trap us inside. "We're running out of time," Torres warned through the headset. "The regulators will begin to fail in 30 minutes. We need to start extraction now to clear the extreme zone before they degrade." I made the decision. The mission objective outweighed personal survival considerations. I located the emergency termination controls, protected behind security measures designed to prevent accidental activation. Using techniques learned from years of work with similar systems, I bypassed the safeguards and accessed the core protocols. "All teams prepare for immediate extraction," I announced over the secure channel. "I'm initiating emergency termination. There may be unpredictable effects throughout the region as the epicenters shut down. I activated the fail deadly system, triggering a cascading shutdown that would propagate throughout the entire network. Immediately, alarms activated throughout the facility. Physical security measures engaged, sealing sections and initiating countermeasures against what the system perceived as a catastrophic attack. "Get to the transport," I instructed my team. "I'll be right behind you." I needed to ensure the termination sequence couldn't be interrupted before completion. As the team evacuated, I implemented final modifications to the system, removing the cancellation options that might allow the Vanguard to halt the shutdown remotely. It was delicate work performed under increasing pressure as the facility's environment deteriorated around me. Automated systems failing as power was diverted to the emergency protocols. The termination sequence reached commitment point, the threshold beyond which it could not be stopped. Throughout the network, epicenters would now be initiating emergency shutdown procedures. The inversion generators powering down in controlled sequences designed to prevent dimensional instabilities from becoming catastrophic breaches. I made my way through the increasingly hazardous facility, navigating around failing systems and security measures triggered by the emergency protocols. The temperature inside was dropping rapidly as climate control systems failed, the extreme cold of the outside environment beginning to penetrate the structure. By the time I reached the exit, ice was forming on interior surfaces. The thermal regulator was still functioning, but I could feel the cold finding ways through my protective gear as environmental conditions approached those outside. The team waited with the transport at the perimeter, maintaining position despite the risks to their own safety. We departed as the facility behind us began to show visible signs of the shutdown process. Energy discharges illuminated the structure from within, as systems designed to contain dimensional energies struggled with the forced termination. Similar effects would be occurring at all 7 epicenters simultaneously, a synchronized collapse of the Vanguard's network. As we moved away from the extreme zone, we began receiving updates from other teams and from Outpost 7. The pattern was consistent across all targets. Initial resistance followed by cascading failures as the emergency termination propagated through the network. The epicenters were shutting down, the dimensional thinning beginning to reverse as the inversion generators powered down. Most significantly, temperature readings across the region showed the first indications of change. The expansion of the cold zones had halted. In some areas, slight warming was already being detected as the artificial extraction of thermal energy ceased. The process would be gradual, with full recovery taking months or years, but the immediate crisis had been averted. The mission had succeeded, but not without cost. 3 teams had failed to extract from their assigned locations, presumably lost to security countermeasures or environmental conditions. Others reported injuries, equipment failures, narrow escapes. The circuit had struck a decisive blow against the Vanguard, but paid a heavy price in the process. As we made our way back to Outpost 7, I monitored the secure channel for updates from across the network. The pattern of reports confirmed what we had hoped. The dimensional breach had been prevented. The Vanguard's 15-year project had been dismantled in a single coordinated strike by a resistance they hadn't accounted for in their calculations. But questions remained. Who exactly comprised the Vanguard? What had they been promised by these architects from beyond our reality? And most importantly, would they attempt to rebuild what we had destroyed? Or did they have contingency plans we hadn't yet discovered? The circuit would need to evolve from resistance to reconstruction. The world had been fundamentally altered by 30 days of extreme cold. Infrastructure was destroyed, populations decimated, resources scattered. Recovery would require the same coordination and technical expertise we had used to oppose the Vanguard, now directed toward rebuilding what remained of civilization. As the transport carried us through a landscape still frozen but no longer actively cooling, I thought about my tower, the place where I had first detected the atmospheric anomalies, where I had tried to warn a world that wasn't listening. It stood as both a failure and a beginning, the point where one technician's observations had ultimately led to the preservation of humanity's future. The circuit's communication network would be the foundation of that future, connecting survivors, sharing resources and knowledge, coordinating the long process of recovery. The skills that had made me valuable during the disaster, understanding the invisible connections that bind humanity together across distance, would be equally essential in its aftermath. 30 days after the world froze, we had prevented its complete destruction. Now began the equally challenging task of thawing what remained and building something new from what had survived. The Ice Age apocalypse had been artificial, a deliberate attempt to transform our world into something inhospitable to human life. Its reversal would require equal intention, equal coordination, equal sacrifice. As Outpost 7 appeared on the horizon, I made a promise to myself and to those who hadn't survived to see this moment. The network would endure, communication would continue, and whatever came next, humanity would face it connected rather than isolated, sharing information rather than hoarding it, working together rather than competing for dwindling resources. The world had ended once. We wouldn't let it happen again. And if you're hearing this broadcast, it means you're part of that promise too. Find a radio. Tune to 121.5 MHz at midnight. We're still out here and we're not giving up.